welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paridon, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 2018 film Operation Finale. The film focuses on the hunt for, capture of, and extradition of one Adolf Eichmann by Israeli intelligence officers and operators. Eichmann was a former SS officer who answered to Reinhard Heydrich and later Ernst Kaltenbrunner, making him third in the pecking order under Hitler for the execution of the final solution to the Jewish question, also known as the Holocaust. Finale stars Ben Kingsley as Adolf Eichmann, Oscar Isaac as Peter Malkin, Lior Raz as Issei Harel, Nick Kroll as Rafi Eitan, Melanie Laurent, Joel Alwyn, and Peter Strauss. Operation Finale was directed by Chris Weitz, produced by Fred Berger, Oscar Isaac, Brian Jones, and Jason Spire. The film was a box office failure, but received mostly positive critical reviews. In the main episode, we talked about the capture of Adolf Eichmann and the Mossad's preparation and execution of the kidnapping of the former SS member in Argentina in 1960. We went into a few of the idiosyncrasies of Eichmann's personality, his guilt, and his murderous legacy at great length. And while the Israelis' kidnapping and subsequent trial of Adolf Eichmann is certainly the most famous of post-war Nazi trials and hunts, it is not the only one to have occurred, not even close. So with that in mind, I thought it would be interesting to get into the cases of a couple of former SS that either were captured or not. Aside from Adolf Eichmann, the most famous Nazi war criminal who was actively being hunted had to be Josef Mengele. Mengele came from a wealthy background. Born and raised in Bavaria, he was known as a serious student who displayed an obvious high intelligence, even at a very young age. Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and soon afterwards was approved for joining the SS. Before he joined the SS, Mengele applied for and was accepted into the University of Munich, where he studied anthropology, receiving a PhD in 1935. In 1937, Mengele joined the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene, where he worked exclusively on genetic factors that resulted in a cleft lip and cleft palate. He wrote his dissertation on the same subject and received his doctorate of medicine from the University of Frankfurt in 1938. Sometime in 1942, and the records are unclear to the exact date, Mengele was assigned as a medical doctor to the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, where he saw action on the Eastern Front and sustained fairly serious combat injuries. His injuries were severe enough to knock him out of combat duty for the remainder of the war. As far as his injuries are concerned, we have no inkling as to what they were and why they kept him out of further combat, but this is just a chilling thought. If Mengele had never been wounded or had been killed in action, how many lives would have been saved at Auschwitz later on? Definitely something to think about. In early 1943, Mengele is sent back to Germany to convalesce, and it was shortly after his recovery, May 1943 to be exact, that he was transferred to Auschwitz. Mengele began his career at Auschwitz in the spring of 1943 as the medical officer responsible for Birkenau's Gypsy Camp. Several months after its liquidation in November 1943, Mengele undertook a new position as chief camp physician of Auschwitz II, Birkenau. Approximately 30 physicians served at Auschwitz while Mengele was assigned to the camp. As a required part or feature of their rounds, quote-unquote, medical staff performed selections of prisoners on the ramp. And these are prisoners that are arriving at Auschwitz via train. These selections determined who from among the mass of humanity arriving at Auschwitz would be retained for work and who would perish immediately in the gas chambers. Mengele was known as the Angel of Death, or sometimes the White Angel, for his coldly cruel demeanor on the ramp. He's associated more closely with this selection duty, quote-unquote, than any other medical officer at Auschwitz, although by most accounts he performed this task no more often than any of his colleagues. This hideously cruel selection process is one of the two things Mengele is most known for. The other would be his medical experiments. Mengele was fascinated with twins and how the genetic similarities and sometimes differences came to be. Before Auschwitz, Mengele performed experiments and did legitimate research on subjects who were twins. While at Auschwitz, however, with full reign to kill and maim, he performed experiments on subjects, mostly children, that he never could have done legitimately before the war. Mengele firmly endorsed Nazi racial theory and engaged in a wide spectrum of experiments which aimed to illustrate the lack of resistance among Jews or Roma to various diseases. He also attempted to demonstrate the degeneration of Jewish and Gypsy blood through the documentation of physical oddities and the collection and harvesting of tissue samples and body parts. Many of his test subjects, quote-unquote, died as a result of the experimentation or were murdered in order to facilitate post-mortem examination. As the Soviets closed in on Auschwitz in 1945, Mengele and the remainder of the SS doctors at the camp fled west. He spent some time in Gross-Rosen concentration camp before fleeing that locale as well, changing into an army uniform and going incognito when he was captured by American forces in 1945. Unknown to U.S. forces, Mengele was released soon after his capture. From then on, he was on the run. Using the infamous rat line, Mengele fled Europe and, like many former SS and war criminals, headed to friendly Argentina. Frightened by Adolf Eichmann's capture in 1960, Mengele fled Argentina and moved to Paraguay, and then to Brazil. He spent the last years of his life near Sao Paulo. Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned while swimming at a vacation resort in Brazil on February 7, 1979. He was buried in a suburb of Sao Paulo under the fictitious name Wolfgang Gerhardt. In 1985, German police, working on evidence they had recently confiscated from a Mengele family friend in Günzburg, located Mengele's grave and exhumed his corpse. Brazilian forensic experts thereafter positively identified the remains of Josef Mengele. In 1992, DNA evidence confirmed this conclusion. Mengele had eluded captors for 34 years. Now, in the main episode, I stated that the Mossad had eyes, or at the very least knew where Mengele was, and listed him as a target during the same operation that got Eichmann. Fearing that by going after both, the attention would jeopardize their true mission, Rafi Eichmann decided Eichmann was enough. Not that the Mossad gave up, mind you. They received numerous reports over the following years and investigated many, but continuously came up empty. The abduction and trial of Adolf Eichmann was high drama, to be sure. And when one thinks of the Mossad and the trials of former SS and war criminals, those events, midnight captures, covert surveillance, and the like, come to mind because of the Eichmann capture and trial. That's how we think all of the post-war trials came to be. However, that's just not the case. Most post-war trials of ex-Nazis were fairly subdued, and as far as I know, there were no more midnight abductions and covert El Al flights out of South America. That being said, the Mossad and the Israelis, specifically Simon Wiesenthal, were pretty damn successful when it came to locating and prosecuting former SS and war criminals. For example, take the case of Josef Schwammberger. Schwammberger is infamous for having been the CEO of 3 separate labor camps within Jewish ghettos in Eastern Europe, Poland specifically. Schwammberger would walk around with a horsewhip and beat people, and would randomly execute prisoners who did not work fast enough for his liking. In 1943, he organized the execution of over 500 people, personally executing at least 35. Having cleansed the ghettos, he sent what few Jews remained to Auschwitz for execution when the ghettos closed down. In 1945, he was arrested in Austria, later escaping into Italy in 1948, eventually ending up in, wait for it, Argentina. Known to be living in Argentina, it wasn't until 1973 that he was sought by the West German government at the urging of Wiesenthal for extradition to face trial. However, Argentina refused to cooperate and he went into hiding. In 1987, he was arrested in Argentina only because of a $300,000 reward. He returned to Germany in 1990 to stand trial. In 1992, he was found guilty on 7 counts of murder and an accessory to 32. Sentenced to life in prison, he died there in 2004 at the age of 92. Maybe a little late, but justice, at least for some, was found. Another former SS who was captured was Franz Stangl. Stangl was nicknamed the White Death for his proclivity to wear a white lab coat around his victims. Stangl worked on the T-4 Euthanasia Program, in which he executed those with mental and physical disabilities from 1940 to 43. Exact numbers of victims is unknown under him. Sometime later, he served as commandant of the Sobibor and Treblinka death camps. Under his tenure as the first commandant of Sobibor, more than 100,000 Jews are believed to have been murdered. In August 1943, he was ordered to take command of the brand new but apparently disorganized death camp at Treblinka. He later claimed that his dedication had nothing to do with the ideology or hatred of Jews. He said that he matter-of-factly viewed the prisoners as material objects rather than people, including their extermination, and I quote, "That was my profession. I enjoyed it. It fulfilled me. And yes, I was ambitious about that. I won't deny it." End quote. Stangl accepted and grew accustomed to the killings, perceiving prisoners not as humans but merely as cargo that must be destroyed. Another quote from him says, "To tell the truth, one did become used to it. They were cargo. I think it started the day I first saw the Totenlager in Treblinka. I remember Wirth standing there next to the pits full of black-blue corpses. It had nothing to do with humanity. It could not have. It was a mass of rotting flesh. Wirth said, "What shall we do with this garbage?" I think unconsciously that started me thinking of them as cargo. I rarely saw them as individuals. It was always a huge mass. I sometimes stood on the wall and saw them in the tube. They were naked, packed together, running, being driven with whips. End quote. At Treblinka, he's linked to the deaths of roughly 900,000 people. Like many other war criminals, he too slipped the noose and escaped into, again, South America, after having first escaped to Syria, of all places. He took residence in Brazil and lived openly, using his real name for years, even though it was a known fact that he lived in Sao Paulo under his own name as an employee for Volkswagen. It took 6 years for Simon Wiesenthal to have him arrested in 1967. He was extradited to West Germany, faced trial, and was convicted of the deaths of 900,000 people. Sentenced to life in prison, he died of heart failure on June 28, 1971. If he had a heart anyway. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we finally discuss the one we've all been waiting for, Pearl Harbor. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.